Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Aniek Ivens. She's an evolutionary ecologist. She's over in the Netherlands. And we're going to talk about cooperation between ants and colonies, or between ants and other organisms. So, Aniek, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How did you first get interested in ants and their relationships to other organisms?
Well, my parents tell me it was really early on as a kid. I was already fascinated by ants. I would, during summertime, walk around in the garden, use my little shovel and dig up ants. So there was already there like a little seed planted. And then I studying biology. I was doing a bachelor's degree in biology, and was general biology, but I came across a course in evolutionary biology, and I realized that actually the evolution of cooperation is a fascinating theme within evolutionary theory. And it turned out that you can perfectly study that using ants. So that really brought my two interests together.
Oh, so what kind of circumstances do you see ants cooperating? Is it with plants or is it with other animals? Like, What do you see?
Yeah, so ants are ideal study systems for cooperation because they cooperate among themselves. So in an ant colony, you could view an ant colony as a single organism with the ant queen who reproduces, and then all the ant workers as sort of cells of the body of the colony. And all those ants among themselves work together and make the colony as big as they get. But then ants also do cooperate with other organisms besides themselves. For example, they keep crops in their nest. They grow fungi as they were crops. They keep aphids and other insects in their nest for honeydew. There are even ants known to plant little trees, and they have, just like we do, bacteria in their guts that help them digest their food. So at all kinds of levels, ants engage in cooperation.
So you said they keep aphids and they plant crops. I guess they harvest fungi and And so tell me about each of these instances. What are aphids and how do ants relate to them?
Yes. Let me first start with the fungus-growing ants. They are, better known as most of them as the leafcutter ants. They occur in the neotropics, so Southern America. And they are very well known because they are a common image carrying big leaves on top of their heads. But in fact, it's not the leaves that they eat, that they cut from trees. They cut up the leaves to feed to the fungi that they keep as crops in their nest, and the fungi, that's their main food source. So they really grow mushrooms, so to speak, in their nest. They plant little tuft of fungus. They maintain the garden. They weed out the fungi they don't want. And when a new queen emerges and flies off to start a new colony, she actually brings a piece of fungus from her maternal nest to start a new colony. So she really brings along the crop for her new colony to feed on. So that's an example of ants growing crops. And then ants keeping cattle. Aphids are the best example. So aphids are usually known as a pest, for example, crops that we grow or on rose bushes in the garden, but they are also occurring inside ant nests underground, where they feed off roots of trees. And because they feed on plant sap, on plant juices, their excrement is actually sugar water, so to speak. So it's really sugary substance, which is an ideal food source for ants that live exclusively subterranean, exclusively underground.
So ants eat the excretions of aphids?
That's right. And they actually solicitous. So they tap with the antenna, they tap the abdomen of the aphid, and then the aphid produces a droplet for the ants to feed on. And this is what we call milking behavior. So this is a very, very stereotyped behavior that the ants only display when near an aphid. And there are different aphid species that cannot live without ants and without being kept by ants. And we call this cooperation because this is really an exchange of food for services. So the ants rely on these aphids for sugar as a food source. It's their sole source of sugar underground, whereas the ants actively protect the aphids against predators. So, for example, other insects that may prey on those aphids, or me, if I dig up a nest, the ants will run out and pick up the aphids and bring them deep into the nest for safety. And the ants clean the aphids. And this is really, really important because those sugary substances, of course, they can get moldy very quickly. And if these ants don't remove them, the aphids will die very quickly of these molds. So this is really an exchange of food for services, and a relationship where both ants and aphids cannot live without the other anymore.
So if you crack open an ant colony, is there like a burrow or a room where all the aphids hang out, or where are they in relation to the ants?
Yeah, that's correct. So I should specify that this does not occur in all ant species. There are hundreds of different ant species across the world, and a subset of them keep aphids inside their nest. But those that do, they build little stables, little rooms inside their nest. And often these rooms are situated along a plant route. So these aphids don't need to move around to get to their food.
Huh. So some of these ant colonies, you'll have like an aphid room, and then you'll have I guess you'll have like a fungal room, or they divide it up into like a house with different areas?
Yeah, that's right. But we usually don't see the same ant species keeping crops and cattle. So usually it's different ant species keeping fungi, but also they make little rooms, little fungal growing rooms, where they still compartmentalize their crops. It's not one big field, it's little subsets, which is of course a really smart strategy, because if one garden or garden room gets infected, they can just remove that without losing their whole crop. And the same goes for ants that keep aphids as cattle. They keep different species of aphids in separate rooms, and also split up little groups of aphids, and that also makes them less vulnerable to, for example, parasites or pests. If one group of aphids in one room dies off, they still have the others to feed off.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, how many aphids will they keep? Will the aphids kind of form their own colony, or what does it look like?
Yeah, you could see it that way. Usually, the ants that I mainly study, they can get colonies with a few hundred to a few thousands of ant workers, and they keep a couple of hundreds of aphids, usually spread out in the colony or very close to the ant colony. And what they do is what we call culling. So these aphids, they reproduce very quickly. They can produce asexually, so they make basically copies of themselves, and they can do this very quickly. So one aphid can give birth to up to 10 small aphids, and if they all do that, you can get, of course, a lot of aphids in a very short time frame. And what the ants do is they eat the majority of the young aphids, which is then a protein source for them. So they really keep the aphids for milk and meat, so to speak. And then they keep the older ones for the honeydew that they feed off, this sugary substance.
Oh, interesting. And so when a new colony is created, when the queen flies off, she'll take some fungus with her, but not necessarily aphids, right?
Yeah, that's right. This is really one of the big open questions still. Where do the ants that keep aphids in the nest, where do they get their aphids from? Most evidence suggests that they steal them from neighboring colonies, or they colonize patches with aphids where a previous ant colony has just died off. So they basically inherit a group of aphids that was living there, and they stay put until they are being kept again by a new ant colony. In the tropics, there are actually examples known of ant queens that bring aphids or insects that are aphid-like on their backs or in their mouth to with the same principle, to start a new ant colony and then start right away with a group of cattle that was inherited from her mother colony.
Oh, interesting. And then the fungus, are the ants bringing in mycelium, or what are they bringing in?
Yes, a little tuft of bacillium. Yes.
Weird. And they know how to cultivate it. They put it in another specialized area. What do they do to grow the mushrooms?
Yes, yeah. So they are really specialized in that. There's also among the ant colony, there's division of labor. So different ants have different tasks in the colony. They basically have a cycle where they take a little tuft and they plant it on top of the mound. Of sort of the top of the garden, and then they chop up little leaves and mix it with enzymes from their saliva, and then that makes a really perfect substrate for these fungi. And then they manure it with their own excrement, and then the fungus grows, and they weed it, and they make sure that it stays healthy, and then they eat the fruits that the fungus grows. And then bit by bit, the fungus dies off, and then there's a new cycle starting. And there are some inherent systems that make sure that the fungus stays the way it is. So this fungus is also clonal. So the whole garden consists of the same clone of fungus. And fungi have a very intricate system of killing off rival fungi. So because these ants feed on the fungi, there will be enzymes of the resident fungus in their excrement, which they use as a manure. And if they, by accident, would have planted a fungus that is not their own, it will die off because the fungus, the resident fungus, kills off this alien fungus with the anti bodies, so to speak, that are in the excrement of the ants. So basically, the resident fungus makes sure that there's no intruding fungus around. And on top of that, the ants are able to recognize their resident fungus from other fungi, and this is something I've shown in one of my earlier experiments, where I offered different ant nests, different fungi, their pieces of fungi from their own nest or from a neighboring nest, and the ants were able to distinguish between their own fungus and the fungus of another nest, even if they don't have their own fungus around, and they kill it off. So they rather go without and then starve to death than accept a new fungus in their nest.
Well, is it same species of fungus, or is it different?
Yes. So in the experiments I did, they were the same species of fungi, just from a different ant colony. And what we were able to show was that this mechanism of distinguishing between the different fungi is strongest in the ant worker caste that deal with the fungi and that deal with weeding out. So they have a very pronounced skill of recognizing their resident fungus. And also we were able to demonstrate that this response is stronger if the fungus is genetically more different from the resident fungus than if they're really close together. So this really shows that somehow the fungus has probably a particular smell that they recognize as their own fungus.
Or the ants, I guess they're in and amongst the fungus, and you said they're excreting onto it to help it grow, and they're chewing stuff up, and that's part of the substrate for the fungus. So I would think the ant's microbiome would be an intimate part of the fungus growing.
Sure.
And I guess the ants, the ant secretions would be in and around the fungus, so they would know that it's theirs and no others.
Yes, that is true. And this is also what we think is happening, for example, in ants that keep aphids in their nest, that they recognize from the smell that the aphids belong to them or to a different colony. But I should add that in the experiments that I was just describing, we actually lab grew the fungus. So the fungus that they were able to recognize as their own was not taken from a colony directly or smelling like the ants. It was grown in a petri dish and then introduced back together with workers from the original colony. So that effect was controlled for.
Oh, interesting. And did they accept it when you grew it independently? Just because
it had
no marks on it, no smell?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Exactly. So they accept their clone, a piece of lab-grown fungus of their own fungus, but they reject fungus that is not their own. So they are able to distinguish between the two.
Oh, very interesting. Everyone talks about ants smelling. What other sensory organs do they have? Do they see? Do they hear? Feel vibration?
Not so much. The ants world, especially of ants that live underground, they rely mostly on smell. That's the way they assess their environment, and it's the way they communicate amongst one another. And that means that their whole cooperation is driven by smell. They do have some other senses, mostly ants that live above ground. They have eyes, and also the queens. They usually, even of the species that live below ground, they come out, the queens come out to fly and found a new nest. They have big eyes. They also, some ant species do work with vibrations. They can vibrate their abdomen as a warning signal. And we think that is mostly it. Maybe they have also some senses in the legs, because they can also assess distance by how many steps they take. But there's a lot to still figure out about ants in that sense. But absolutely, smell is the majority of their sensory input.
Well, maybe there's also vibration and other types of cues. Maybe there's audible cues. Can you tell if ants can hear? Do they have like spiracles or holes in their cuticle for ears?
Most not. I think there are one or two species where they might be able to hear something, but there's very little known about that. And the majority also of the neurological research that is being done on ants focuses on smell.
What about the microbiome of ants? Has that been at least 16S sequenced and looked at versus different species? Like, what's observed?
Yes, yeah. So this is a really booming field with the new 16S technology that has been coming out over the past few years. There are a couple of ants species that have been very well studied. Among them are a group of ants that have nitrogen fixing bacteria in their guts, and they have a tight association. A particular bacterial strain or group of bacterial strains that are always found in these ants. Then there are army ants that have been studied for the microbiome. They have another set of bacteria that are very common among different closely related ant species. And for my own research, I studied aphid tending ants, and they have a strain of bacteria in their guts that likely plays a role in the digestion of sugar. And this is also a very unique strain that is only found across the world in aphid tending ants. So there seems to be a coevolution going on as well. And then there are some transient bacteria that we find, we might find, we might not find. And it's more likely that they are picked up from the environment. And they might colonize the guts as it fits the diet of the ants, but there are not obligate bacteria that are needed for the ants to survive and to do their digestion.
How do you know if there's bacteria in the ant's gut that helps the digestion or not?
Yes, so we don't know. So this is still a speculation. What we could do is descriptive research so far. So what we've done is 16S sequencing of the ant's guts and cross-referenced the sequences that we found in 5 different ant species that keep aphids in their nest across the database that exists of all the 16X sequences that have been reported. And there we found that the specific sequences that we found are very closely related only to bacteria found in the guts of other ants. But also really different places in the world. So, for example, it's the same, almost same strain found in the ant guts in Japan as in Northern America. And then we can look at what bacterial species have been described that closely resemble these and are closely related, and what functions they have. The particular bacteria I'm talking about are Acetobacteriaceae that are known to play a role in sugar processing. They also have a function in industry, sugar processing industries. So we think that for now we can speculate that that's the role they play, because they are only found in the guts of ants that have a highly sugar-rich diet, and they seem to be so specific and that we know they play a role in sugar processing, that for now we are assuming that that's the role they play. So this was genetic evidence, and then we also looked with microscopic evidence, so staining bacteria in the ant's gut, and we see also in the location of the gut that seems to be a location where sugar may be processed along the ant guts. Of course, the next step would be to isolate these bacteria and see what they do, and maybe feed different ants, different diets, see if the bacteria increase in the guts, and do all kinds of experimental studies, because so far that's mostly descriptive, but that's really future plans, and unfortunately we have not been able yet to do that or isolate these bacteria.
What about the microbiome of the queen versus the workers versus soldiers?
Yes.
And then the microbiome of the males that are briefly created, the virgin queens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So this has been analyzed not by myself, but by colleagues that study other ants, and it has been repeatedly shown that the workers that deal mostly with the food and the nursing, they have the most complete microbiome, and that, for example, males that only live for a short time and only mate and afterwards die, they have a almost blank microbiome. Whether it differs between soldiers and workers, that depends on the species. Not all species have different castes, but there have been descriptions of caste differences in microbiome composition, for example. And for the queen, I don't recall that many studies where a lot of queens have been tested. I would have to look that up, but of course it's always, in terms of sample sizes, it's harder to get enough queens to analyze because there are so few that I don't know on top of my head whether there are good studies about it. I think 1 or 2, but I'd have to look them up.
What about the microbiome of aphids?
Mm-hmm.
Has anyone looked at that when they're under the ant's care, if there's a lot of similarities or not?
Yes. This has been a prime focus of my studies at the Rockefeller University, where we actually studied 2 species that are interacting nutritionally, and we studied their respective microbiomes, because you can actually envision that it's not per se the ants that are interacting with the aphids, but it's the microbiome of the ants interacting with the microbiome of the aphids. So we were very interested in that, and what we found is that the microbiome of the aphids is highly specific. In the gut, not so much, but they have specific organs where they keep bacteria that play a crucial role in their ability to feed off plant juices. So the bacteria, Buchnera is the most well-known. It's a bacterium that helps them to upgrade nutrient-poor plant juice with amino acids for the aphids to live on. And this bacteria is so crucial that there are known aphid species known in the world that don't have these bacteria, and the bacteria are transmitted what is called vertically. So they are transmitted from mother aphid to daughter aphid, always the same clone. And you are also, no one has been able to cure successfully aphids from from these Buchnera, for example, with antibiotics, because they die. They really need these bacteria. Very much expected. We found these Buchnera also in the root aphids that we studied in the ant nests, and we found very specific strains of Buchnera in their guts, and no surprises there. But in addition, we found 2 more bacteria that also seem to be specific, highly specific, and to be transmitted from a mother to daughter aphid. And we have to as yet find out what the function is of these additional, what they are called endosymbionts, but they might play a role either in the life together with ants, or the ability of these aphids to feed on tree roots.
Very interesting. Wow. What in particular are you trying to figure out at this point? What's your research going towards?
Mm-hmm. I'm still wrapping up studies that I started at the Rockefeller University, and that was really trying to map an interaction network, so to speak. So we knew that there were, at the beginning of the studies, that there were a couple of ant species in the area just north of New York State that kept a couple of aphid species and mealybug species in their nest. So mealybugs are another aphid-like insect. And we wanted to adopt this system into the lab as a model system for microbiomes, because we could really, like I said, we could really study 2 interacting microbiomes. But in order to do so, we needed to find out who was interacting with whom. So what I set out to do is to study with field studies, digging up ants in the forest, doing DNA studies to specify which ant species kept which aphid species and how specific these interactions were. So if I would only find a particular aphid species in the nest of a particular ant species, so that pretty much everybody could interact with everybody. And what I found is that this is quite specific, and that it correlates with the microbiome. So that is really interesting. It seems to be that we're dealing here with a tiered level of specificity and cooperation, where specific ants keep specific aphids or mealybugs that have specific microbiomes in their gut. But like I said, this is descriptive, and what we hope to do in the future is to now add behavioral studies in the mix and test in the lab whether those specific ants that keep always those specific aphids, whether they reject other aphids, for example, or even further in the future, if we were able to isolate some of those bacteria, if we infect them experimentally in different aphids, whether that affects the choice of the ants. And so we really want to get at mechanisms underlying what we call partner choice in such a system. So the mechanisms underlying which ants choose what aphids to keep in their nest or not.
Yeah, I think there could be a lot of different possibilities. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Have you tried to take aphids out that are already been cultivated and isolate them for a while and then reintroduce them and see what happens?
Yeah, that is one of the major challenges of this system. It has been really challenging to keep them in the lab and keep them alive for lengthy periods of time. So the ants we can keep in the lab. We can feed them regular honey, and they can live up to 3 years in the lab. But the aphids, like I said, they get moldy really quickly if the ants are not around. So I had to, by hand, with a tiny brush, clean every individual aphid every day to prevent them from getting moldy. So basically, I was milking the aphids in the lab, and because of that, they survive to a maximum of 2 weeks in the lab, and after that they usually die. So we've only been able to do those studies with 2 weeks in between, and there we did not find very clear results, except for that the ants seem to be able to still recognize aphids that came from their own nest, as opposed to aphids that we collected from a different ant nest. But we didn't see any preference for different aphid species, for example. But it's still preliminary studies, and we would need to be able to keep bigger numbers in the lab to really say something for sure.
It'll be interesting if you had a colony with no queen, and if it had aphids in it, you took the queen out, the the colony would still function, I guess, for a while, but what would happen to the carrying of the aphids and the fungi? Mm-hmm. Have you tried any of that?
Yeah, so this has been studied for the fungus-growing ants as well. And usually when the queen dies, at least in those species, then the colony ultimately dies because no new workers are being raised. So it's anyway an ending story as soon as the queen dies. What has been shown occasionally, this is really anecdotal evidence for fungus-growing ants, but I think there are also some findings in termites as well that grow fungi in their nest, that it might be the case that the ants suppress sexual reproduction by the fungi. So basically the making of huge mushrooms, fruiting bodies of the fungus. And when they stop suppressing that is the moment that the fungi can actually erupt in a mushroom and spread spores, which is usually, as long as the ant colony is alive, not possible.
Are there mushroom growers that use ants specifically to increase the yield of their mushrooms? Has anyone taken it that far?
No, not that I know of. But these are also really ongoing studies. This is a relatively new field in that sense. And there are many different ant species doing this, and there are many different fungi involved. There are really interesting studies ongoing on this.
Well, very good. So, Anik, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you and find out more about your research?
The best way to get in touch with me would be to check out my website, www.aniek, that's NANIEK.NYC. And there is also a contact form. So if you have any more questions, then that is the way to contact me.
Well, very good. Anik, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been very interesting.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invite.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at FindingGeniusPodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.